Many people talk about risk-based testing, and it sounds great on paper, but not many people have a deeper understanding of what risks are and how you use risks to come up with a risk-based test approach. Now, in the What is a Risk video, I explained what risk is. In this video, I want to talk about how we use the language of risk to formulate a risk-based testing approach. I should say, about 20 years ago, I wrote a book with my good friend Neil Thompson titled Risk-Based E-Business Testing. I have to say, not much has changed in the last 20 years or so. Now, in the What is a Risk video, I suggested this definition of a risk. A risk threatens one or more of a project's cardinal objectives and has an uncertain probability. I'm going to stick with that definition for the next few minutes. Now, what we can say about the relationship between testing and the evidence we produce from testing and risk is that we can reduce some uncertainty, and although we can never eliminate the possibility of failure, which is obviously the case, what testing does is it reduces the uncertainty about a mode of failure. What we can say is that we believe the probability of the system failing in a certain way is reduced to some degree. It would be nice to think we could measure these things precisely, but we can't. So we just have to take it on merit that testing can provide evidence that reduces people's perception of risk. But let's talk about the relationship between faults, failures and risk. Essentially, system failures are what we fear, and the faults that cause these failures are the basis of these failures. This is what we're looking for, to try and detect and fix them and eliminate them, if you like. And it's this uncertainty about whether the system will fail in certain ways is what makes us concerned, and certainly our stakeholders, for them to be concerned. Because we can't answer the question without testing. We can't answer the question what type of faults are present in the system. We can't say how many faults are in the system. We can't say that we've removed all the faults in the system. But what we can do is, on the basis of probability and with some degree of certainty, that testing can be focused to look at specific areas of the system, specific modes of failure, and we can try and demonstrate those modes of failure, and if we can't do that, our confidence is going to increase a little bit. What's the connection between risk severity or impact and incident or bug severity? There is a relationship, and I just want to explain what that really is. A product risk is just a potential mode of failure. So what we do when we look at the potential for risks and failure in our system is we are making a speculative bug prediction and saying to ourselves, suppose we found a bug or a failure like this, what would we do next? Would we treat it as a high severity priority one bug, or would we say it's cosmetic, we don't care? What we're trying to do with our risk analysis is to make predictions of the kind of bugs we might expect, and on that basis, the ones that are most important, that allows us to focus our testing in a better way, to select features to test a bit more, or to select features to test or not test, depending on the risk of failure. Now, if our risk assessment steers test activity in that way, we're going to design tests to expose failures. We're going to explore the risks of those failures, if you like. And of course, if we discover bugs, we can fix and retest if they're serious. And we provide information to our stakeholders to allow them to reassess those risks with more confidence, with more knowledge, with more information. And by reassessing risk and hopefully reducing their perception of risk because they know a bit more and of the likelihood in particular, their fears of failure ought to be reduced, their confidence should increase. Now what we do with our risk definitions, our risk descriptions, is we can use them to define test objectives. And we can make some statements about how this actually helps us. If we focus on risks, we know that the bugs relating to those selected modes of failures are bound to be important because we can predict how we're going to regard those modes of failure as higher severity and therefore more important. If we focus on particular bug types, if we get into that level of detail, we'll probably be more effective at finding those bugs because we have a definition of what the bug will look like, and we can create tests that specifically try and stimulate the software to behave in the way that we predict could be serious for us. If testing shows that certain failure modes are unlikely, we become more confident that the system will work in production in some incremental way. But how do we define a test objective from risk? I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly and just give you a sense of how it works. But the essence of it is that we use the language of the risk that we're concerned about to describe the test objective that will help us explore that particular risk. So suppose the risk is a bad thing happens. It doesn't matter what that bad thing is, but it's a problem for us if it does occur. Our objective might be to demonstrate using a test that the system works without that bad thing happening. And the overall definition of a test might be something like this: to execute user journeys to check that bad things don't happen in a range of scenarios. And we might use test design techniques to select those ranges of scenarios that give us most confidence to achieve some level of coverage that matters to us. I've shown you 3 examples of risks versus a potential test objective. I'm not going to talk about these. You can pause the video and read it for yourself. But having said all that, if we just look at risks alone to define our test approach, usually this isn't quite enough. We need to be careful that we just don't go looking for bugs and nothing else. Clearly, there might be a requirement to show that functional or non-functional requirements are met. Obviously a natural thing if we have a set of requirements defined in detail. There might be contractual obligations that have to be explored, and we need to provide evidence they are met. And this might include whether the users actually find the system usable, of course. There might also be regulatory requirements we have to pay attention to. There's lots of things that you have to bear in mind here. But if you just focus on risk and risk alone, you might open yourself up to missing some important things. With respect to risk-based test planning, it helps our stakeholders in that they have a better visibility of what's going on in your mind when you are looking at how to structure the activities we call tests through the life cycle. Because some risks will relate to features that can only be tested by developers, maybe with automation. Some risks relate to things that users can test, but only very late in the day. At any rate, we get our stakeholders more involved by talking about the things that they fear the most, and it will focus their attention on the things that we are going to test. RBT helps testers because it allows us to demonstrate another dimension of coverage, if you like, of the risks of most concern. So it gives us the commitment from stakeholders to test the things that are most important to them, that are most critical to them. But it also gives us the approval to not test stuff that will be out of scope, because the risks of those aspects failing is much lower or not of concern at all. At the end of the day, it gives us a clearer objective to aim at from the point of view of testing. We're not just guessing what's important. We know what's important from the conversations with stakeholders. Risk-based testing also helps developers because we can identify very specifically, on the basis of the risk analysis, that some features have to be tested more thoroughly and probably at a component level, only by developers using test automation of some description. So it kind of gives the developers no hiding place, so we can pin them down and get them to focus on the things that are most important to our stakeholders. When it comes to execution and reporting, the risk-based approach helps stakeholders because they have visibility of what's going on. They can see why we're testing the way we are, and when we report successes and failures in our testing, they know what it means. They can understand and interpret our reports a little bit better. It also helps management insofar as we can report progress against a list of risks that we're focusing on. And in effect, when we stop testing, the risks that have not yet had all their relevant tests executed or have passed, we can see what are the risks that block acceptance, that block progress. So we know what to do next and what we need to talk about if we do have this critical moment where we have to decide to release or not release or continue testing or whatever the outcome of that conversation is. We make better release decisions with a risk-based approach. I want to explore very briefly what it means to have a test pass and fail and how that affects our perception of risk. Suppose our test passes, what can we say? Well, the first thing is a test pass has nothing to tell us about the severity of the risk, the impact of the risk, because that is what it is. You know, whether it occurs or doesn't occur, our perception of the impact will be the same. But if a test passes, the risk probability would be higher because, well, no, it can't. It tells us exactly the opposite. If a test passes, it gives us an incremental amount of evidence that demonstrates a system will work, even though we tried to make it fail. It gives us an incremental amount of evidence to suggest that the system is less likely to fail. So a test pass affects probability of failure to some degree. If a test fails, how does that affect our perception of risk? Well, a fail, in the same way as a pass, it tells us little about the impact, the severity of a risk that we are concerned about. It only gives us a piece of information about the probability of failure. Now, suppose we get a fail. The probability of failure could be higher in our perception because we discovered a failure that we weren't looking for or we were not expecting. Maybe we found a bug in a product that we've trusted for many months or years, and suddenly we discover it fails. That's going to undermine our confidence. It's going to make us think that a failure is more likely in some aspect that we didn't expect. It's not good. But the probability could also be lower, because if we detect a bug, if we cause a failure, we diagnose it, we fix the bug, we retest, we regression test, we're going to reduce the perception of failure in the future because we found the problem and we fixed it. So that problem ought not to reoccur. In summary, thinking about the risk of failure and judging which risks are more important than others and basing test objectives and testing on the understanding of risk and the prioritization of risks, it helps us to identify features that we will test for sure. And it might help us identify some features that we think we don't need to test. But at more precisely, what happens is we can use risk to help us identify things that we'll test more and some features that we will test less. So what it does, it allows us to focus our efforts on the things that matter, and hopefully it's a more optimized, more efficient approach to planning and executing and reporting testing.